Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be outlining the basic structure of the nervous system. Now, as you can see in the picture to the left, we've got the brain, we've got the spinal cord, cranial nerves, things like the spinal nerves, but you can actually categorize these into groups or subdivisions. So for example, the brain and spinal cord collectively forms its own group. It's called the central nervous system. So what we're going to do is break down this, almost like a flowchart, this nervous system structure. So we've actually got two big groups that the nervous system can be divided into. The central nervous system, consisting of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. So let's just make a note of that to begin with. So we've got the peripheral nervous system. I'll just write NS for nervous system, just for speed's sake. And we've got the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system comprises of, as I've said, the brain and the spinal cord. So we'll just make a note of that there. The brain and the spinal cord. Now, the brain is protected by the skull, or cranium as its proper scientific term, and the spinal cord ultimately is just a thick extension of nerve fibres that runs down the hollow middle of the spinal vertebra. So I'm only drawing a very, very quick sketch here. It's not a particularly amazing picture, not to scale. This is just one of the spinal vertebra. What you find is there appears to be like a hole or hollow middle right in the middle of it. And it's through that, I'll just try and draw it a bit like this, that the spinal cord ultimately passes through. So the spinal cord, this thick extension of nerve fibres, just runs through that hollow middle of all of these spinal vertebrae. And the brain and spinal cord collectively form what's called the central nervous system. Now, pairs of nerves that originate from the brain and spinal cord form what's called the peripheral nervous system. So essentially, we could highlight all of these spinal nerves. You can see they're coming from, if I draw an asterisk, this brain and spinal cord. These spinal nerves are coming from that CNS, that central nervous system. I'll write that up here as well, those letters C and S, because that's often what central nervous system is abbreviated to. So you've got the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system, as I said, essentially comprised of these pairs of nerves that originate from the brain and spinal cord, and they emerge at intervals along the spinal cord. And we can divide the peripheral nervous system into two groups, the sensory nervous system and the motor nervous system. So we'll just make a note of those two here. So we've got the sensory nervous system, but we've also got the motor nervous system. Now, the sensory nervous system consists of what are called sensory neurons, which are ultimately just nerve cells with glial cells, which are kind of act like supporting cells. So nerve cells and glial cells form these sensory neurons, and they carry nerve impulses from receptors towards that central nervous system. So we'll just make a note of that here. So those sensory neurons, or part of the sensory nervous system, comprises of nerve cells and these things called glial cells, which are supporting cells, and they carry information or nerve impulses from receptors towards the CNS, the central nervous system. Whereas if we consider the motor nervous system, what you have are motor neurons in the motor nervous system that carry impulses from the central nervous system to what's called effectors. So these motor neurons actually carry impulses from the CNS to called effectors, which bring about the response. Now, the motor system can be categorized again even further into two subgroups: the voluntary nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So I'll just make a note of that, and then I'll explain exactly what these two subgroups do. So we have the voluntary nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now, the voluntary nervous system carries impulses to things like body muscles. So we're talking skeletal muscle, and it's under, this is the key thing, it's under voluntary control or conscious control. So the voluntary nervous system carries impulses to body muscles. Just make a note of some key things here. To body muscles, and it's under conscious control. The autonomic nervous system, however, that carries impulses to things like glands and smooth and cardiac muscle, and that is under involuntary or is subconsciously controlled. So this is to glands, smooth and cardiac muscle, and there's not quite enough room there, but that's under involuntary control. So that's how we can break down the motor system even further: voluntary nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Now, it is possible to break that autonomic nervous system down into two more subgroups: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So if we shrink the screen, I'll just move the screen up just so we can have a little bit more room to write. We're going to finish by breaking down this autonomic nervous system. So there are two ways that we can divide this, as we said: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is the one that stimulates the effectors. So that in turn would speed up activity. In fact, it controls activities in stressful situations, such as the flight and fight response. The parasympathetic nervous system, however, does the opposite. It inhibits the effectors, so it will slow down activity. It tends to control activities under normal resting conditions, and actually one of its key jobs is in the conservation of energy, and it replenishes body reserves. These two systems, and this is really important, they work antagonistically, which means they kind of work against one another. So when the sympathetic kicks in, the parasympathetic isn't, for example. So I'll just make a note just to highlight the key point. So the sympathetic is the one that stimulates. I'll just put an arrow for stimulates, so it increases the activity of effectors. It stimulates the effectors, whereas the parasympathetic is the one that slows activity, and it reduces or inhibits the effectors. And these two together work, and I think that's a key word to make a note of, they work antagonistically. So they're opposing one another. So we've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And that ultimately is it. That is the layout or the structure of the nervous system. We will divide it into two: the peripheral and central. The central consists of brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral we can break down further into sensory and motor. The motor nervous system we can categorize into two: the voluntary and the autonomic nervous system. And then the autonomic nervous system we again split into two: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. So that's just a very quick breakdown of the nervous system structure. Okay, hope all that helps.